And we are on the air. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Codementor office hours. We are very, very excited about today's session. It's going to be a little bit different than prior sessions. We're going to have a full hour Q&A with one of the legends of the Ruby on Rails community, Michael Hartl. And so I just want to get right, into the meat of things. So I'll give Michael a short little intro here, and then, really what we want this session to be is you guys chiming in via chat or the Q&A app with your questions. I have some questions people have emailed in. But jumping right in, for those not familiar, Michael Hartl is the author of the Ruby on Rails tutorial, one of the leading introductions to web development, and is a co-founder of the Softcover self-publishing platform. His prior experience includes writing and developing Railspace and developing in Sochi. In 2011, Michael received a Ruby Hero Award for his contributions to the Ruby community. He's a graduate of Harvard College, has a PhD in physics from Caltech, and is an alumnus of the Y Combinator Entrepreneur Program. So everybody quietly welcome Michael Hartl to the office hour sessions. But Michael, before we jump into questions, maybe obviously that's sort of a quick background on where you've been, but do you want to maybe give us a little update of what you've been up to, what some of your current projects are?
Sure. Well, I just recently finished the third edition of the Ruby on Rails tutorial. So this is the book launched, I guess third quarter last year, and then I finished up the screencasts for the third edition. That's a huge amount of work to get those screencasts out. So those launched, I think technically they launched on December 1st, but they were done. I told people I would probably be done by the end of November, and they were done, but they launched, I think, on December 1st. So that's that consumed quite a few months there in 2014. And going forward, what I'm doing is working more on Softcover, which you mentioned in the intro. So Softcover is a publishing platform it's basically optimized for the kinds of products that I make. So right now, the Rails tutorial is running on top of Softcover. So Softcover is a company a couple of friends and I have founded, and it consists primarily of a production toolchain for making ebooks, and then an integration with an online sales platform. And where we're going with that, I'm really excited about. We're actually planning to make it possible to publish shorter documents. So we're focusing on things like articles instead of books. And this is good for me, among other things. I'm hoping lots of people want to do this, but I've kind of been stuck. It's like I have so many book ideas, but it's a lot of work. It's a lot of commitment. The Rails tutorial is like, when I first wrote it, was like 6 months of like full-time work to finish the book. And that's solid. So figure it's probably more like 7 or 8 months to get everything to come together. And I've been thinking, man, I want to make more products. I want to make some follow-on products for people who like the Rails tutorial. And I have some ideas for some books, but it's just so much to bite off. Even having done it a few times now, and I know it's involved, it's like, oh, man, that's so much work. So with Softcover, we're going to be looking at shorter documents, things that would maybe be like a chapter in a book, so that it's not as intimidating, right? You can get started and have a product for sale, or be collecting email addresses or so on, and just have a stepping stone to making a fuller information product like the Rails tutorial.
Very cool. So yeah, hopefully, the future equivalents of what the Rails tutorial has been for some new technology can come out a lot faster if people can publish it quicker.
Yeah, and it's also a way to test the market, right? You can write an article on a subject, and if lots of people love it, then now you know, okay, well, now maybe I should write a book on this. And if you write a series of articles on related subjects, and you can see this when people write a series of blog posts, like those should be articles, they should be there should be ebooks for sale, like screencasts associated, or some sort of templates, code, samples for sale. And if you do 2 or 3 of those and people really like it, well, now you've got your first 3 chapters and you're off to the races, potentially.
Awesome. Yeah, MVP, lean startup for books.
Exactly. That's really what it is. It's like taking it to, just going down to a lower level of risk in terms of how much time you spend. And the truth is, the Rails tutorial was a pretty big risk. I spent a bunch of time writing the prototype of the production toolchain, the ebook maker, and it was like I probably spent a year before I even really launched anything and was making money on it. And I don't recommend doing that generally. I think that's a little bit too. I think I had a good handle on the market, and I had some, like, an inside track on some promotion, but that's probably more time than you want to be spending for a first self-published information product.
Gotcha. Well, very cool. Well, we're all excited to see the next stuff to come out. But now, if we can jump into some specific questions, I'm gonna start with a couple that were emailed in, and I see some
Okay.
people are starting to chat some in live, so that's really good. So first one off, I thought this would be a good one to start with. For those who haven't gotten to dig in to the Ruby on Rails tutorial, or who might not, even be familiar with your work yet, can you give us a quick summary of what do you cover in the tutorial broadly, and what have some people gotten out of it? Have you seen some sort of success stories out of it?
Yeah, sure. So the Ruby on Rails tutorial is designed as a general introduction to web application development. So it's not specific to Rails in the sense that, especially with the new third edition, it really focuses on the things that you're going to have to learn no matter what you use to make web apps. Uh, and so Rails happens to be one of the best choices for that, I think. Uh, Generally speaking, I try not to assume anything, but in terms of background and prerequisites, but it can be pretty rough going if you don't have at least a background in HTML and a little programming. But that being said, quite a few people have told me that they got through the book completely cold. They just didn't know anything about programming. A lot of people have said that their strategy was to go through the book and then go through the book again. Just do it twice, which is actually it's a pretty good strategy, I think. So it's aimed at sort of an intermediate level in the sense that by the time you finish the Rails tutorial, you should be good enough to consume pretty much any of the other programming educational resources out there. So that's how it was conceived, was a product that would let people sort of a book and screencast. That's what it is. So it consists of a book that's available for free as an online version, and then I sell ebooks and screencasts. And if you can get through this tutorial, you will basically be ready for anything else out there.
Awesome.
And among other things, that means you can try, you can probably get a job as a junior developer or make your own projects. And I've had tons of people have told me that that it's made a big difference. Like I'll go to a conference and someone will see me walking along. They'll say, "Oh, I just want to say thanks. I owe my career to you." And so then I say, "Well, anytime you want to, that's awesome. I'm happy to accept like a 10% fine cut for if you want to cut me in on that." But no, it's really very gratifying to find out from emails and in person that it's made a big difference to people. So yeah, there are a lot of success stories out there, and I really hope to keep growing those, because it's really, it's a successful product business, but I'm not trying to make the most money in life. Right? There are lots of things I could have done, a lot of different choices I could have made if I were just trying to make tons of money. So making something that I know is helping thousands of people learn a valuable skill is very satisfying.
Awesome. So we have a lot of beginner coders that follow Codementor and I believe are tuning in, and a lot of them are saying they were told that Ruby is the best place to start at the beginning if you're just getting started in the programming journey. Do you believe that's true? And if so, why?
I would say that Ruby is one of the best languages to start with. One of the reasons it's good is because Rails is such a big player, and I think in the US at least, Ruby didn't really take off until Rails kind of became a driver for Ruby adoption. Ruby is a friendly language for beginners, generally speaking. I would say the other two big contenders for a good first language in the modern day are Python, which was actually the first language that I really loved, and JavaScript, which I don't think is a particularly pretty language, but is ubiquitous. It runs in every browser, and there's lots of established code bases in JavaScript. So generally speaking, I would say that it'd be hard to go wrong with any of those choices. But if you're interested in writing web applications, which a lot of people are these days, then certainly Ruby is a great choice. And this is actually a live topic for me, in the sense that I'm thinking about making a product for beginning programmers, because a lot of people ask me if they can do the Rails tutorial without any programming experience, and I tell them you can. It'll probably be pretty tough, and so I would like to be able to say you can try it out, but if it's too hard, I've got another thing for you, right? I've got a product for you. I've got a book for you to read. So I have some recommendations in the Rails tutorial about how to get started programming, but I'm definitely thinking about getting into that myself. And for that product, for that book, I have to make a choice. Do I want, like, what language do I want to use? So right now I'm thinking about both Ruby and JavaScript. I feel like Ruby is so much nicer though that it's really hard to argue against it.
Yeah, very readable.
Yeah, and I mean it's all so it's if you I mean if you really dig deep into programming, you'll eventually find that the Lisp programming language is kind of the language that it's kind of it's a platonic ideal in the sense it's actually not a programming language so much as it's a general model for computation that happens to be implementable as a programming language. And so in that sense, the closer you can get to Lisp, the more power you have over the computer. And Matt, the creator of Ruby, that's his nickname, which everyone calls him Matt. His name is Yukihiro Matsumoto, and he describes Ruby as his personal Lisp. So he basically took the parts of Lisp and another very powerful language called Smalltalk and combined it with some aspects of the Perl programming language and some other influences and put it all together in this package that is a great blend of power and readability and expressiveness. So like the problem with Lisp is that it's almost too powerful in the sense that you can do anything and the result is that everyone just does his own thing. In terms of every programmer does their own thing. And with Ruby, I think it's clear that there are lots of people out there collaborating, writing software that's going to last for a while, whereas it's harder to point to Lisp projects that have the same longevity. And I think part of that is because Ruby dials back the power just a little bit, but the result is that it's a lot cleaner and more generally accessible to like a larger group of programmers.
Cool. I'm going to jump to some of the questions that are popping up as we're talking. So Steve was wondering, is it backward to use Rails to learn Ruby? Should it be the other way around? Do you have a philosophy on the sequence there?
Sure. So the thing there is that I was saying that that Rails drove Ruby adoption, but that doesn't mean that you use Rails to learn Ruby. What I would say is that a lot of people want to learn how to write web applications, and they don't want to spend 500 pages of potentially weeks or months of effort learning Ruby before they get to that. So part of the issue there is just motivation. If you're excited about writing web applications, then it's kind of hard to slog through a whole Ruby book. Now, I did learn the basics of Ruby before I learned Rails, but this is back in like 2005 when there was hardly anything out there, 2006 maybe. And so what I would say, and there's another consideration, which is that the parts of Ruby that Rails uses are different from what you would get in a general introduction to programming with Ruby. So for example, in Ruby, generally speaking, every method, every function returns some value, whereas a lot of the functions that you write in a Rails app consist of controller actions, where there's nothing being returned. There's just an implicit behavior that if you have an action called index, and you go to the URL example.com/, well, actually, a better example would be no, that's fine. So example.com/ gets mapped automatically to something called index, and so that hits an action called index, which doesn't return anything. What it does, doesn't return anything that you would see in the index function, but rather renders a template called index.html.erb that gets returned to the browser as a string. And so that kind of behavior is really weird if you come from a pure Ruby background. So that's why for people who are excited about web apps, I generally recommend getting going with web application development and learning just enough Ruby to get by. And so that's chapter 4 or lesson 4 in the Ruby on Rails tutorial. Is basically it's like let's take a chapter, catch our breath, and learn the basics of Ruby. And then after that, go on and look at a more comprehensive Ruby source. But it's certainly not wrong I would say if you're motivated, if you're like, I really feel like I want to learn Ruby solidly before touching Rails, that certainly isn't wrong. Like I definitely don't think that that's a bad idea. It's just that a lot of people's motivation will flag if they take that route.
Gotcha. So I have a question, interesting question from Ahmad. This is definitely, I think, more from the perspective of, I think people are curious what you've seen from, I guess, students that have used your tutorial. How do you keep the motivation going after you finish one or multiple tutorials? I guess really, in terms of learning. And then the second part to that is, how can you get out of that tutorial sort of mode and start to dig into working on, say, an open source project or implement some idea from scratch if your experience has just been those tutorials? Have you
Yeah.
have you gotten to watch sort of new programmers go through that transition?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I get emails about this fairly frequently, and I think that there's no one size fits all answer, but I think the key is to work on things that you're interested in and that motivate you, that you care about. Like you need to find a project where you want something to happen and it's not happening because you haven't done anything yet, and you're just like, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get this thing to happen. Like I want to write a web form that goes out to a third-party API and pulls in some data and combines it with data that the user puts in. Like, and I know it's going to be awesome if I can just do this darn project. And so it's almost like you have to get to the point where you're angry that it doesn't exist, and I'm going to do whatever it takes. Sometimes people say, hey, have you ever used Ruby, or have you ever used JavaScript in anger? Have you ever used regular expressions in anger? And I think that's part of what people are talking about. It's like you're so unsatisfied, or so dissatisfied with the status quo that you're going to do whatever it takes to get it to come into the world. So that being said, it's important, I think, to break out of the tutorial mindset, to reach out to other people and go to meetups, go to find online communities where I mean, I guess Codementor fits into this, doesn't it? But the idea is you need to talk to other people and just get help getting past the sticking points, because it really is a big challenge to go from something that's very structured to just looking at a blank sheet of paper, so to speak, so blank editor window, and saying, all right, well, what next? Mm-hmm. Now, I do what I can in the Rails tutorial to help with that transition by putting in exercises that that give you an incentive, give you some tips on how to take that next step. But the truth is that it is a real challenge to go from a structured learning environment to just like the Wild West. And like now, the great thing is that computers can do anything, but that's also a curse, because like, all right, well, where do I even start? So
Mm-hmm.
Reaching out to finding something you care about a lot, and finding a community of people where you can get advice and mentorship is, I think, that those are the two things I'd recommend the most.
Yeah, I think your instinct earlier you mentioned of writing a book for beginners is probably on. We have a lot of questions that are related to getting started. So Christopher, who is in the room here, actually just mentioned, as a newer developer, how long have you seen it typically take from total noob to really building a large web app? There's probably a million examples there, but what comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it really depends on your background. And when you say newer developer, that's someone who's assuming that you've had like just a little bit of programming background. Certainly, you can get really good in a matter of, 6 months, and possibly even quicker than that. I mean, I've seen some people just go nuts, and like they'll do the whole tutorial in like a week. And I would say that if you're willing to give it a full-time effort, I mean, certainly in a couple of months you will have leveled up on a practically daily basis. So it really depends on how much time and you can dedicate to it, and how determined you are. But it's certainly not the kind of thing that takes years and years. I think you will certainly look back at the code you wrote a year before, or 2 years before, or even a few months before, and say, wow, that's awful. I can't believe I did that. But that's a natural part of, I still do that, right? That's a natural part of the learning process. So I would say it's going to take you 10 years to get really good. And the thing is, I don't even really consider myself that good. I'm really good at the Rails tutorial kind of material, but if I were, if someone wanted to hire me as a web developer, I would have to spend a good couple months just getting completely up to speed on whatever their technology stack is. So it's a matter of months if you're determined.
Gotcha.
Not years.
So this is an interesting one that was emailed in. This is a little bit more about the Rails community.
Yeah.
So as a newcomer to Rails, it's really difficult. This person saying for them to know what tools, gems, platforms to use. What do you recommend to alleviate that problem in the community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm gonna rotate here. I'm getting some sunlight. I'm coming to you live here from the Huntington, which is a it's art collections. It's a library, art collections, and botanical gardens in San Marino, California, adjacent to Pasadena. So, and I'm getting some sun here, so I'm going to overheat if I'm not careful. It's a beautiful, like 80 degrees and sunny. I can show you the background here. This is the San Gabriel Mountains there in the distance. So, uh, if I don't stay out of the sun, I'm going to get burned. um, yeah. So the Rails community, I think, is I mean, it is one of the best aspects of Rails because people really have come to has come together around this framework. I think, in fact, this is one of the big advantages it has, well, that Rails has over a lot of the JavaScript stuff that's going on, because there's no clear winner in the JavaScript world, and it just seems like everyone kind of rolls their own combination of JavaScript packages. It seemed for a while that Angular might be winning, but then now they're making there's a whole new version that's going to be backwards and compatible. So I feel like Rails has this kind of continuity where things move forward, but not so and quickly. They move forward fast, but not so fast that everything is broken all the time. And there's also just a real a tradition of being welcoming to new people, especially like Ruby. I mean, Ruby kind of sets the tone for this. There's a what is an aphorism in the Ruby community. It's -1. Matt is nice, and so we are nice. So Matt, the creator of Ruby, is an unbelievably nice guy, and I think that certainly pervades Ruby, and Rails has picked up on that part of the Ruby culture. So I also see that the people who develop Rails principally, they use it all the time. They are, I mean, they have a major financial investment in the continued success of the platform, of the framework. So one of the things I've seen over the last, maybe 8 or 9 years is that Rails is always adapting to changes in the technology landscape. So I'm definitely optimistic that Rails will continue to be a major player in web application development and just software development generally. Among other things, there's a lot of I get questions about these like front-end JavaScript frameworks, like these single-page apps, but those things still need a back end. They still need something that's going to that handles authentication, that talks to the database, and Rails is great for that. A lot of people use Rails essentially as a back end for a JavaScript front end.
Awesome. Kind of piggybacking on that topic, where do you think Rails is headed? What's it going to be capable of in 5 years that we can't do today?
I feel like in technology, 5 years is a lifetime. So my predictive abilities for 5 years are pretty bad. But I will say that the kind of applications that just involve a series of web pages where people fill out forms and they click on things and then a document comes back, like that covers a lot of different uses, right? I feel like something like Twitter or Facebook is eventually you're going to have lots of fancy stuff that gets pushed to client side to like speed out like super optimizations. But the truth is that you could start the next Facebook or Twitter or whatever using a pretty straightforward web app that doesn't have to be anything fancy. Like in terms of the MVP, the minimum viable product, it does not have to be anything crazy unless you're like trying to replicate a desktop app in a web browser. I feel like that general model of web development, it covers like almost all the use cases that matter, certainly when you're just getting started. So I feel like on the one hand, I don't want to try to predict where things are going. On the other hand, the basic model of web application development that's I think that's kind of come into existence in the last decade or so isn't going away anytime soon.
You don't have any concern of it not keeping up with any of the other state-of-the-art languages like Python or anything like that?
I don't. No, I feel like, I mean, if anything, I think Python is a little bit of a lagging indicator, or sort of they're a little behind Ruby and Rails when it comes to. So I mean, the closest analog in the Python world is Django. So Django is probably the winning, or sort of the most popular Python web application framework, and I get the sense that they're not quite, like they don't move quite as fast, and they also have some problems with compatibility. Like I think there's a new Python version, like what is it, Python 3, something that they're having real trouble getting adoption because it breaks a bunch of important libraries. Whereas, I mean, the Ruby world is on the latest version of Ruby like instantaneously. I mean, it's just incredible how fast the adoption goes. So I feel like the Ruby world moves at just the right pace, fast enough that it's a little bit scary, but not so fast that things are always in an error state.
Gotcha. Um, so Uzi, who's in the room, wants to know, can you talk about evaluating Rails as a solution for a given project? For example, a promotional site or a lead gen app that requires a CMS user input. So how do you look at a project and decide, Ruby is, or I'm sorry, Rails is the right way to go?
Right. So I should say first of all that I don't actually do that kind of stuff. I don't do contract web development anymore, and I don't work in. I mean, I'm probably not the best person to ask that question. Like the kind of somebody who works at a place like Pivotal Labs that's always taking on projects for startups, or people come in and say, hey, I want a web app that does X, and then they've got a bunch of really great programmers on staff who put that thing together. Those are the kind of people who know how to do that kind of evaluation. Like I don't actually do this as part of what I do, but that being said, I mean I can observe what other people do, and what I would say is that if you want to make something that's essentially a desktop app in a browser, then you really have to use JavaScript, because that's what's going to be executing on the client inside the browser. But apart from that kind of app, I would say that Rails is, I mean, certainly something like a CMS or a lead like a lead gen app, that Rails would be an outstanding option for that. And basically, if you're going to be rendering web pages based on information in a database and requiring some sort of login and authentication system, Rails is a fantastic choice for that.
Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of questions around the topic of scaling. I think Rails definitely has this super positive reputation of being easy to get started off the ground, but then at scale, everyone mentions the older version of Twitter as an example of it not working out. Is that hype? Do you believe that, or have you found there are techniques or gems or server configurations that break that rule?
Right, so I have inside information on this, actually, because I know people who work at Twitter, and Twitter scaling problems had basically nothing to do with Rails. There were architectural problems at Twitter, and basically any language or framework that is operating at that scale is going to need lots of customizations. So people say, oh, well, Facebook uses PHP, so PHP must be scalable. Like, I mean, Facebook does crazy stuff with PHP to be able to scale up to the enormous scale they're operating at. And the same thing with Twitter. Like they had architectural problems that were not related to Rails. So Ruby is not a particularly fast language, but that rarely matters in web development. So what I would say is that if you, so there's another thing, which is that the kind of default way of setting things up is much faster now than it used to be. So I mean, it's funny that people still worry about scaling. Like there is no way that scaling is going to be the problem that kills you, at least if you choose Rails. At this point, and especially at this point, there are so many huge sites that use Rails on the back end, or use some closely related technology like Sinatra, which is like a minimalist Ruby web app it's almost like a micro framework. So, for example, Disney.com, last time I checked, is a Sinatra app, and all of the sub properties at Disney are Rails apps. So I mean, Disney is getting an enormous amount of traffic. Airbnb is a big Rails app. So it's clear at this point that you can operate at an enormous scale with a Rails, with Rails being your principal technology. But the thing is, you don't actually scale a framework; you scale like the system around the framework. So at this point, I mean, I understand why people worry about it, but you will solve that problem when you get to it. Rails is not going to be the limiting factor in your growth as a company.
Right. Yeah, it would be a nice problem to have for most people.
Yeah. I mean, it is a real problem. Like, I mean, I can literally think of only one example. I think Friendster died because they couldn't scale, but and apart from that, and the things have matured so much too. Like I had a company a while back where we did have problems handling the traffic, but this was like 2004, and there was no Amazon Web Services. Like we had a co-located server, and now you're on Heroku or something like that. You just spin up some more dynos, and you can throw money at the problem so much more easily now than you could. Not only can you throw money at it, but it's unbelievably inexpensive in many cases. Where it's like you've got you have storage problems. Okay, well just add some more Amazon, just like upload it to AWS, and it's going to cost you like 5 cents a month or whatever. A lot of these problems are just have just gone away because of the maturity of the technology landscape.
Sure. So maybe you can kind of hit two birds with one stone on this next one, but there's a few people that are curious. I guess in situation again with the scaling or tasks that require more horsepower. What are some other tools that you can use alongside Rails to kind of get through tough periods like that? And then along the same line, what are the other technologies that you personally are using and enjoying coding in that aren't ones you write about?
Yeah, so starting with the first question, I see the asker mentions Go, which has gotten a lot of attention. So Go is developed by Google, and it's a relatively low-level language and is like super performant. So I do know people who use Go alongside a Ruby or like Rails web stack. So I mean, nowadays a lot of web software, or just it's really practically like I guess most software these days is some sort of web or is running on a like on a tablet device. A lot of them have communication between the different pieces through a well-defined API. So one of the techniques that people use is that they'll get hack out a prototype, and as they run into production bottlenecks, then they'll sort of peel off that some narrow piece of functionality, rewrite it in a faster language, and then have it communicate with the original app using the API, the application programming interface. So the truth is I don't actually have a lot of experience writing those things. I know people who do that kind of stuff. In terms of the technologies that I use, the truth is that these days I've moved. It's kind of funny. People really recruit me because to be like their tech person. They want like a CTO, which I'm not available for anyway. But even if I were, I'm not actually a CTO, like temperamentally, or like that's not my thing. I feel like the CTO needs to be excited about the putting all the technologies together and like making the technology stack and like really getting excited about shaving microseconds or milliseconds off the like microseconds are huge, I guess they're tiny, but yeah, but shaving milliseconds off response times or whatever. What I mainly work on these days is taking what other people are doing and digesting it down and like distilling it, and so that and then explaining it to people so that people can get started with the technology. So the truth is that for my own company now, Softcover, the tech side is my co-founder, Nick Merwin. He's the one who geeks out on he pays really close attention, for example, to the JavaScript world, and I pay enough attention to be able to answer questions about it, but I haven't really dug into anything except Ruby for a while because I've been so busy with the Rails tutorial 3rd edition, improving the production toolchain for the ebook production toolchain for Softcover, and that's all in Ruby and Rails. So at this point, what I'm as I move forward, and especially as we add in the capability to make articles, I think I probably will dig into some of these technologies and like maybe Angular or Meteor or something like that, and learn them well enough to write something about it, and then see how that goes. See if people like that. See if it'll give me a chance to learn something cool. But at this point, I'm actually operating at a sort of the next level of abstraction up, where I think a lot about marketing. I think a lot about how to drive adoption of what we're working on, and how to take what other people have done and like to know enough about the latest technology trends to to figure out like what's a good product to make and how best can I serve my current audience in terms of things that they'll be excited about learning.
Awesome. So actually, that kind of also leads kind of nicely into more of an education question. So obviously, you're a fan of the written tutorial
Yeah.
um, as a learning method, but what other methods are you seeing as highly successful when it comes to learning code? And I think I'm going to throw in that the answer can't be jumping in on a project. I think obviously that's probably ideal. But
Sure.
what are the out of all these
Yeah.
new things? There's all these boot camps. What are you seeing as valuable there in terms of the learning curve?
Yeah. So it's hard for me. I look at a lot of these things, and I know a lot of the founders at the companies that are doing this kind of stuff because I've been around. I've been doing this for a while, and I've been really excited to see how it's just so many different things have taken off. So I think the answer really depends on what your background is, and what your learning preferences are. So, for example, there are a lot of people who just don't like screencasts. They'd much rather read text, and there are some people who just feel like they can't bring themselves to read through a book, but if you put a screencast in front of them, they'll sit down and say, "Oh, I'll just watch this. This is great." And then there are a lot of online sources where you're typing in a browser, and it's kind of you go through a series of coding steps. So I think all of these play a role in or have their place. I think investors are excited about the kinds of things that are new in the sense that people using the web in a way that is uniquely suited to the web. And the reason for that is because investors want a huge return on their money. So something like writing a book, for example, isn't exciting to them because books have been around forever. But on the other hand, books have been around forever. And it's really weird to me when people they say it's like books or even screencasts, which are basically just like movies essentially. That they'll say, oh well, that's not new and exciting. Like people have been learning like difficult subjects through long-form technical narrative since Euclid. Right? I mean, this is not going on since before Euclid, but this general format of telling a story through through some sort of document is not going away. So my own angle is to try to tell a story through a book and then through the videos in a way that keeps people motivated, that sort of hooks into that part of their brain that learns through narrative, which is I think a really important part of the way human beings learn. Like, humans have been learning through stories for since they started walking on two legs, and I also think that there's a real advantage to using having a text version of your teaching tool, because the web is made of text and links, and if you have something that's made of text and links, then it's kind of native to the web in a way that these other things aren't. Even if they're making use of things you can only do through the web, they're not accessible by search engines. They're not going to work on some devices, and so I really like the idea of making something that can basically work anywhere in the world on any device. And so that means the web, and it also means ebooks.
Gotcha.
So yeah.
I'm sorry. No, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I have to ask, like, what do you think about these programs of 3 months, go from nothing, and we promise you come out ready to get like an 80K job? There's just ads for
Right.
those everywhere.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you also asked about these hacker academies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll go back to what I said before. It really depends on where you're coming from and what your how much structure you need. Like, some people are super motivated and literally they'll just power through the Rails tutorial in a few days, which to me is just insane. I don't know how you can do that. It's incredibly admirable. It's really amazing. Whereas a lot of people, especially if they have less background, really want to be surrounded by other people who are learning the same thing. So I know for sure that these academies can be great. Like, I know a lot of people who've gone to them, who've graduated, and there is a robust demand for web application development, and specifically Rails. So I certainly think that those are worth looking into. I'm not skeptical of the general concept at all. I can't generally offer guidance on the specific academies because I only know enough about a few of them to make any recommendations. But it's certainly, like, I think it's a welcome trend. That, I mean, it's almost like people have rediscovered the virtue of learning a trade, like of learning something where you can exchange your time for money, and you can, by making stuff. It's kind of funny because I went to grad school in physics, and I could have gotten a job doing any number of things, including a postdoc in physics. I could have continued on with research, but I got to the point where I realized that I didn't have any really simple way to say, like, I'm just going to sell my time for I'm going to make things in exchange for money. And it was a relief when I learned Rails, and it's like, okay, now I've got a trade. Now I can sort of bootstrap my way to making products, because I can take a contract gig and do some custom web app development. So to the extent that these academies help people learn a trade, I think they're fantastic, and a lot of them are potentially very valuable.
Great question from Christopher that segues nicely with that is, how did you start learning Ruby? What was that transition for you, and what worked for you when you started?
I mean, yeah, this is a hard question to answer because I learned programming pretty young. And let me say, I think I have a realistic assessment of my programming. Like, I'm a strong developer, but I'm not, like, there are these 10x developers, people who are just 10 times better than everyone else. And it's possible that if I'd studied computer science, or if I'd really just decided to go that route, I mean, really, if I were fundamentally a technologist, maybe I could have gotten to that level. But I'm not like a superstar, like ridiculously amazing developer. I'm just like, I'm good, but I'm not like freakishly great. But that being said, I did learn to program when I was, I don't know, 10 or 11, writing BASIC, and have learned probably a dozen general-purpose programming languages over the years. So in that sense, for me, learning Ruby was pretty easy. At the time, I already knew Lisp, or I knew Scheme, which is a dialect of Lisp. I knew Python. I knew Perl. I'd programmed in C and C++ and JavaScript and PHP. So, like, for me, it's kind of like if you know like 3 or 4 Romance languages, picking up a 5th, it's not that hard. If you already speak like Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and French, like you can learn Romanian pretty easily, right? Like, Romanian is not going to be that big a stretch because it's also a Romance language. Although I guess Romanian is probably, but anyway, you know what I'm saying, is that if you have a bunch of things that are all in the same cluster, then it's relatively easy to pick up. So I feel like my own experience is not going to be useful to the kind of people who are asking those questions, who probably didn't start programming when they were 11, and don't already know half a dozen general-purpose programming languages. And so in that context, I would say that in any challenging subject, like, there is no substitute for just continuing at it. Like, nobody finds this stuff, like, not nobody, almost nobody picks up these hard subjects just effortlessly, right? And even those people, I mean, if you look at prodigies, for example, like chess prodigies, such as Bobby Fischer, he was like naturally really good at chess, but he studied like crazy, right? Like, he picked it up fast, but he also worked harder than anybody. And so if you work that hard at chess, you're not going to be as good as Bobby Fischer, or or any other chess great in all probability. But you'll be a lot better if you work really hard at chess than someone who's merely like kind of has a knack for chess but was never got serious about it. So if you can outwork a lot of people, like, some people maybe have a real knack for computer programming, but they're lazy, and it's a struggle for you. But 10 years later, you're going to be running circles around the people who have a knack for it but didn't apply themselves. So that's what I would say is that the most important thing is realizing you can get really far just by keeping at it.
Yeah, well, it also sounds like that variety that might have been accidental at first, of knowing all those languages, ended up being a huge plus for you. Is that something you're recommending to new developers? Because it's also kind of a trend of like people picking almost like religions of what language they're going to learn and stick to. Do you recommend more diversity?
I definitely recommend learning multiple programming languages. It's hard. Picking up extra languages is difficult, and there are language families as there are with human languages. Like, for example, if you speak if you speak Mandarin, picking up Cantonese is going to be a lot easier than if you're coming to it from Swahili, right? I mean, because there are the languages resemble each other, and I mean, if you speak Mandarin, you already read Cantonese because the written language is identical. So but I would say that there's been a real process of maturation in programming languages in the last decade or so, where there are a lot of similarities between a lot of the top languages. Like a lot of them have dynamic components to them. They a lot, even the notation for things like arrays is very similar across different languages. So if you pick up Ruby, you can probably, I mean, and really know it, you can learn, Python, JavaScript, Scala, and any number of other languages in a relatively short time. I mean, you'll get competent quickly, and then you'll realize that you've gotten 80% of the way there, and then you need to get the other 20%, and that'll take as long as getting that first 80%. But the cool thing is you'll get better at your whatever your current language is by learning these other languages too.
Awesome. I really like that. Kind of zoning back into the Rails world for a little bit, there's some other questions about, this is almost like insider baseball, but, do you have any examples of, are you seeing any Rails projects that are using the framework in an especially innovative way? Whether it's a company doing something interesting or even a small-time project?
Let me think about that. I mean, it's hard to tell. I mean, it's hard to tell because you rarely see people's code bases. I mean, I can think of,
or maybe
I don't know anyone's code base well enough to know what they're doing that's new and different.
Right, or a project that is written in Rails and you see from the front end that it's almost impressive they pulled that off with Rails. Is there anything coming to mind for you for that?
Let me think about that. Yeah. I'm trying to think of what name some impressive websites out there. The kind of thing that might,
people throw them in the chat. What sites are blowing you away right now? We'll let that question marinate for a second. Okay, this is a good one. What are the most common mistakes beginners are making on Rails?
Oh, common mistakes. In terms of the coding errors, or
or
I'd like to
or even
clarification of what that means.
Right, or I mean, I think also probably in the sense of approach and philosophy. A lot of these, I think, a lot of these questions are about people kind of diving in for the first time.
Yeah, think about that. Common mistakes that people make when learning Rails or learning web development. I mean, nothing springs to mind really. I mean, I guess. I mean, I would generally recommend people manage their expectations. I mean, maybe one mistake, in a sense, is thinking that it's going to be smooth all the time. I guess so. Actually, that is something. I'll get emails from people saying, "This like, I've spent 2 hours on this one thing. I can't believe it's taking 2 hours." I'm like, dude, come back in 2 days. Like, I have flushed days and weeks down the toilet trying to debug stupid things. So that's one mistake I think people make, is they don't realize that this is hard. No matter how smart and experienced you are going to run into things that just kick your butt. And in those contexts, sometimes you just have to get angry and say, like, I'm going to do whatever it takes. But you also have to develop an awareness of when you've just depleted your resources and it's time to take a break. So I have a phrase that I use called making a run at something. So I just to pick a really stupid, I mean, almost embarrassing example, a couple of months ago, I was trying to install a new version of Ruby on an iMac. I couldn't figure it wasn't working. Like, something was like OpenSSL, some library wasn't configured right, or like I'd installed OpenSSL with Homebrew wrong. It was ridiculous. This is stupid, right? Like, by any reasonable standard, I'm an expert at installing Ruby on things. But here, like, after like an hour, I'm like, I just give up. I'm going to have to make another run at it later. And maybe like a week later, I said, all right, I'm going to try this again. And and I was able to find some other way. There was some other, I forget, some route, some path that I had missed the first time, and I was like, and I got it to work. And I recorded what it was. I forget what it, I mean, I can pull it up. I have a text file where I just keep these things that I figure out. Yeah, so it involved this. I'll, I'll, it involves pasting this in for this. I don't know if anyone can see it, but there's this ridiculous Ruby configure options that I had to pass to the compiler, telling it where OpenSSL was for the security parts. And I was like, this is ridiculous. But this happens to everyone. So expect that stupid things will go wrong and that you're going to blow 2 hours just spinning your wheels, you have to you have to develop an intuition for when just powering through it is the way, and you're just like, I'm not going to let this go until I solved it, and when to get up, maybe even just take a 10-minute break, or say I got to take a week and just let this simmer, or I got to talk to somebody else. So that, I think it's important to realize that, and then I would say this is one of the downsides of these like very carefully managed learning environments that do things like everything in the browser and so on. And I mean, I think things do go wrong in those cases, but you're not in the wild, so to speak. And in my educational philosophy, sort of the niche that I feel is everything is for real. And so if I do an intro to programming, like, we're going to be using a text editor right away. It's weird. I see this trend of like learning to code, and if you look at I think it's code.org, they have these like these ways of learning to program that are like, they're super graphical, and like they try to abstract away all the pain. And I understand why they do that, but I feel like, I don't know, can 12-year-olds not learn to use a text editor? I'm pretty sure that they can. And in fact, they're probably too naive to realize that they're not supposed to be able to learn a text editor, right? So like, they're going to be fine, and they're going to run, and they're going to run into trouble and realize and think that that's just the way it is, which is the way it is. That is the way it is. And like, I've been doing this long enough that I don't think there's any way around just random stuff going wrong. So there's a danger. I think it's good to get people motivated and to kind of hold their hand early on, so that they're not freaking out about all the things that are going wrong. But the truth is that things go wrong all the time. Like, literally, when I have to run the test suite for the softcover production system, I'm like, all right, well, I haven't run this in a few weeks. It's not going to work, because like something will have changed. Like it'll be the wrong version of Ruby, or I'll need to reinstall something stupid. Some stupid thing will like have stopped working in the interim, and I'm going to have to spend half an hour figuring it out. And that's just the way things are. And I think it's important to realize that as soon as possible.
Awesome. Well, yeah, guys, please pop in any final questions. We're down to the last 10 minutes or so, but other than obviously the new edition of the tutorial, what are your favorite resources that you recommend to people who are studying up and always learning?
I'm sorry, could you ask the question again?
Oh yeah, just beyond the new edition of your tutorial, what are the other resources that you recommend to people that are learning?
Yeah, so I have a bunch of links in. There are some links in the chapter 1 of the Rails tutorial, and then a bunch of them are repeated in the final chapter, chapter 12. So it really depends, again, on what your preferences are. But let's see, I'm just looking it up here.
Maybe just name drop a couple of them. Yeah.
Yeah, so now I know. So I'm looking at it here. But so one great resource. It's kind of stalled out a little bit recently, but it's still got a lot of good material, which is Railscasts. I'm hoping it'll come back someday. The creator has been on hiatus for a while, but there's still just tons of great screencasts on a bunch of different subjects. I've got some links to. There's some online resources. There's an academy called Tea Leaf Academy, and another site called Thinkful that pairs you with a professional engineer. I've got a friend who started one of these full-time in-person academies called the Turing School of Software and Design in Denver, and you actually go there and live there. And that's if you want to like completely take the plunge, that's the kind of thing. I think it's a great resource. I also have a link to Code School. I've been following them for a long time and really excited to see all the great progress that they've made. They just actually got bought by a company called Pluralsight for a tidy sum, so congratulations to the Code School people. And I also there's Dan Kehoe who has an introduction to uh, sort of basic Rails development, like very beginner friendly. Also maintains a site called Rails Apps that has just a bunch of curated Rails applications, and I think that's probably a good idea to look over, either from there or just go to GitHub or look around online to find projects that maybe aren't too huge, but that are digestible, and take a look at how they work, how they're structured and organized.
Cool. Um, well, yeah, I think on that note, we can start to wrap up. One last question that was just
Yeah.
really popular was a bunch of people were wondering, have you hired Rails engineers, and what do you look for in one? Um, yeah.
Yeah, so I had basically have no experience at this. So I mean, I don't know what I would look for. I mean, I can imagine that what I would look for is people who have a track record of shipping things. I feel like shipping is almost a separate skill from development. Like, you need to learn how to develop things, but then you also just have to finish them and get them out the door. So I would certainly look for people who have examples, who've proven that they can actually contribute to a project or make a project of their own. I'm a little skeptical of programming style interviews. I feel like it's basically impossible to tell from those. I don't think I would do. I mean, like, it's weird. I occasionally get like recruiter emails from big time companies, and I'm like, I don't even think I could get through the technical interview at a lot of these places, because they would ask me to do things that I'm in context that I'm not comfortable, and it's like, really, just go to my GitHub, just read my book. If I'm not a good fit for you, then then you'll know it from that. So I would generally look for a record of actually producing things, and wouldn't place a lot of stock in my ability to tell from asking you like to write code on a whiteboard if you know what you're doing.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I think on that note we will wrap stuff up. But thank you so much, Michael. And we obviously recommend everyone to check out the tutorial if they haven't yet. And obviously, Codementor is always at your disposal. If you have any Rails projects you're having trouble with, you can get some great help there. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for the great questions. And this was a really cool session. This will be up on YouTube on the Codementor channel as soon as we end here. So feel free to
Great.
come back and reference this. And yeah, with that, I'll say good afternoon, good evening, good morning with people all over the world.
Yeah.
And thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for having me, Mark. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's fun.